This is 9/11 Freefall.
Happy New Year, everybody. 2015 is going to be a great year for 9/11 Truth. I'm joined by some great guests to start out this new year today for this episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm the host, by the way, Andy Steele. My guests are going to be Graeme MacQueen, Elizabeth Woodworth, and David Long. They're all Canadian activists. They've been on this program before, and they're going to be talking about all of the great things that are happening in Canada right now. A petition is being submitted to the Parliament in that nation seeking a new investigation into 9/11. Of course, we talk about it all the time on this show, the scientific evidence that proves that Towers 1, 2, and 7 of the World Trade Center complex in New York City were brought down with explosives on that day. And we brought on expert after expert. We're going to keep on doing it into the new year, and 2015 is going to be the year of change. I can feel it. And the vice is tightening on those who protect the official story, those who keep the cover-up going. Because of great activists like the ones on this program today, because of great activists like you out there in the audience, and we just got to keep on pushing, keep on bringing this issue to the attention of as many people as possible. So, great way to start out the new year with this episode. I'm going to play that interview for you in just a minute. Before I do play the interview for you, though, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. I am joined today by three great individuals and 9/11 activists. My first guest, David Long, was there in New York City on the day of September 11th. He saw the controlled demolition evidence of the buildings for himself. He's been an outspoken activist for 9/11 Truth for several years. He's been on the show covering or giving me the report from the ground on what I call the Battle of Ottawa and another Canadian places too. So David Long, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks. It's great to be on the show.
My next guest is Elizabeth Woodworth. She's a journalist and she's an editor for David Ray Griffin. She's also a co-founder of the 9/11 Consensus Panel. She writes for globalresearch.ca, and that's actually one of my favorite news websites. I try to check it out every morning. I think that the audience members should too. She was on a year ago or so to discuss Google's search algorithms and how it seems that they censor 9/11 Truth-related searches. You can hear that interview in the archives. She's back today. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Good to be on your show again.
And finally, we have Graeme MacQueen. He's been on the show in the past as well. He's a professor of peace studies, retired. And among the papers that he's authored was the one that documents from the oral histories of the first responders the 118 accounts of explosions on the morning of 9/11. He is the founder of the McMaster Center of Peace Studies in Canada and its War Health Program. Graeme, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's good to be here.
And one thing that all of these folks have in common is that they are all Canadian. And, of course, if anyone's been following this show, been going to AE 9/11 Truth in the past month, they know there's a lot of action taking place there, a lot of progress. We're going to be talking about it today. So before we do get into all of that, though, and we'll start with David, tell us a little bit more of your background, your history with 9/11 Truth. Why do you continue to be in this fight?
Deep breath. Well, as a lot of people know, I was in New York when the 9/11 attacks happened and was very nearly killed in the attack. So I took that personally, as I suppose anybody would. After 9/11, I became involved in the truth movement because I came to deeply understand very quickly what the errors and omissions were with the official story. And along the way, over more than a decade now, I've met an amazing group of people, and even now, as we're now into the 13th year since the attacks, I'm still learning about 9/11, and I'm learning new things from all kinds of people. And I've worked on many initiatives, and I see the momentum building, and it's actually an incredible time in history. And I think what we're doing in the truth movement is truly historic, and we don't even know the effects that we are going to have with the work that we're doing. So that's how I got into the movement and why I'm here.
You know, what you say reminds me a little way, just on a symbolic level, of those science fiction stories in which somebody goes back in time and they might make one footprint and it causes all of the Earth to change in some weird, strange way. Maybe people become evolved into a different species or something. Now, that's science fiction. But you talk about the work we're doing, and we don't even know what kind of effect that we're having. It goes back to the whole butterfly wing scenario where the flipping of one butterfly's wings can cause a hurricane somewhere else on the planet. Now, I don't know about the science on that, but that's more of a symbolic statement on how one person can make a difference, but not just one person, groups of people. And what we do now, we may not see the results of until later on. So that's why it's important to do things whenever you can, however you can, because it will come back in some way, in a good way. Elizabeth, same question. You know, a little bit more about yourself, what's kept you going, what keeps you in this fight here 13 years after the event took place.
Okay. Actually, I'm a librarian, medical librarian, Andy. And what happened, how I got into it was in about April 2006. My neighbor, who is a psychologist for the school board, handed me a book, The New Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin. And I read that book, and it changed my life ever since. I wrote a review for it. I thought he laid out the evidence so compellingly, and I've been used to looking at evidence for many years in my job as a medical librarian. So I wrote a book review, and I contacted the author, and that was the beginning of an 8-year working relationship with David Griffin. And so we did about 7 or 8 books together where I and Todd Fletcher and David would work on all these books. He would write the chapters, and we would edit them and proofread them. And then we decided in 2011 that we would get all the professional organizations that were dealing with 9/11, and we'd pull them all together into the 9/11 consensus panel. And that's been working really well. And Graeme is, as I mentioned, he's a reviewing member of the panel. And the reason I stay in it was spoken more truly than anybody else I've ever heard by Niels Harrett, Dr. Niels Harrett at the University of Copenhagen, Emeritus. He's a retired professor of nano technology there. He was a chemist. And he said, when he spoke to you on December 11th, that the truth about 9/11 is the most important pivotal event in our century, and that if we can break that open, it will be the event that leads to the transformation of society, because it's such a huge thing. It's changed the world so much, and if we can see the truth of 9/11, it will change the world in a different way. So I'm starting to write a book about 9/11 as transformation. And I completely agree with Niels.
You know, you're talking about 9/11 as transformation, and it makes me think of the event as something that is continuing even now. I mean, the initial shock and awe and the initial horror is worn away, but the end results of it, what it ultimately will mean for the world, is still being written now as we talk in this interview, as you guys do what you're doing in Canada, as AE does what it does all over the world. And it reminds me, I've told this story before, the day after 9/11, the local radio station in Tampa, where I was going to college, played the Beatles song Let It Be. And the message I get from that was, you know, there will be an answer. And at that point, it was almost like some voice was telling me, you know, you're angry about this now, you're being reactionary like most of the country, but let it be. There's more to it. And I almost feel that's the message that was being put out, because we never know all of the details of something when it initially happens. Graeme, same question. Give us a little bit more background if you want, and what keeps you in this here 13 years after the event took place?
Okay, well, Andy, when I tell my story about how I got involved in 9/11 and how I continue in that, it's often kind of a confession narrative, because I've been an anti-war activist for a long time before 9/11, certainly for over 2 decades. And, you know, and that means everything from being on the street demonstrating, being arrested, blocking, you know, a bomb-making plant, starting a program at the university in peace studies, you know, going to war zones and meeting with people and talking about the way they were tortured, you know, a whole range of stuff. So when the 9/11 events happened, I should have gotten onto it. In fact, I'd been in Afghanistan before that, and I talked to Afghans in Peshawar just a few months before 9/11. And they were already talking about how the U.S. was about to invade them. So there are all kinds of signs and signals and stuff that I should have said, whoa, what's going on with this 9/11? But, you know, I pretty quickly was tricked after some initial skepticism and waiting for the evidence. I would say that I fell asleep for several years. I was curious, but not curious enough to really step back and get out the books and look at it. So it wasn't until 2005. My story here is quite a bit like Elizabeth's. You know, I decided finally to look into this 9/11 thing. And so I read some stuff. One of the things I read was David Ray Griffin's book, and also some of his articles and a few things other people had done, and quickly realized, whoa, you know, this official story is nonsense. It doesn't hang together at all. And so I began doing my own research, and it's after that I wrote the article on the eyewitnesses from the fire department of New York, and then just went on from there to be involved in many different initiatives. 9/11 Consensus Panel, Toronto Hearings, Journal of 9/11 Studies, and so on. In terms of what keeps me going, you know, I don't know how to answer that, except that people used to ask me that back in the 1980s when we were out there trying to stop nuclear war. I don't know any other way to live. I don't know that there's no guarantee we're going to be successful in exposing the truth here. I didn't know if I was going to be successful in stopping nuclear war in the 1980s. But I don't know any other way to live. Do you live knowing that this enormous lie has been perpetrated and you're just going to ignore it, or you're going to be cowardly, or you're going to go to sleep? I don't see how you can do those things. Once you know the danger, once you know the deception, once you know what the challenge is to us, it seems to me you have no choice. You need to go forward. You need to do your best. And so that's what I'm doing.
Well, 9/11 itself was spoken of earlier as a transforming event, and it's amazing how much this event has transformed not just the world and nations and how people think, but just people on a personal level. And before we get into the stuff going on in Canada, I'd like to hear from all of you, if you can, just how has it transformed you more personally being in this over the last 13 years? What ways, not even just related to 9/11 and being aware that it was controlled demolition, but just in how you see the world and your relationship with it? We can start with David.
Well, the day before 9/11, I was like most New Yorkers, going to work, and I was a peace activist in my teen years, but I gave up on that, to be honest. And after university, it was really just about my career, and up until the day before 9/11, if you'd asked me if I cared about politics, if I cared about Republicans and Democrats or communism or world peace or green politics or anything else, I wouldn't really have taken much interest in it, because I was making a really good salary. I'd worked really, really hard to get to where I was, and my life was really about doing all the things that everybody else around me was doing, and who was running the world and what their policies were and why they did. It didn't matter to me at all. As long as the framework, as long as I had a way to get to work and do my job and be successful, how that happened didn't matter to me at all. Well, that all changed on 9/11. Now I am a person who I see politics as something that is a job, it's a responsibility of every single person in the world. And it is, to give an analogy, when you live in a house, you have to keep the house clean. Everybody has to take out the garbage. Everybody has to keep their place clean. And there are jobs that you don't want to do. Like, I don't like taking out the garbage, but if I don't, my house is full of garbage. So dealing with politics, dealing with these messy issues, if we do not take out the trash, which is dealing with corrupt governments, dealing with lack of integrity, dealing with lack of transparency, all the issues that surround 9/11 and every other issue, if people think that they can just rely and there's a word that is so lost today, which is trusting that the government in whatever country you're in is actually faithfully discharging their responsibility as the governing authority acting in your interest. If you actually just are a person who hopes that this might be happening, that the government is actually working for you, well, 9/11 is a giant wake-up call that they are not. And if we fail, all Americans, if all Canadians, everybody in the world, if we fail to take charge of the issue ourselves, then the future is going to be one where we ultimately, every one of us, will be responsible for what happens next. It's that important. And that is how 9/11 has changed me. And it's why I would go with the other activists in Ottawa last few years, handing out something like 12,000 DVDs in the cold for free, like many other people. So what keeps me going now is that I know I have a job to do, and that's how 9/11 has changed how I look at things.
Elizabeth, beyond knowing 9/11 was a controlled demolition in New York and all of the consequences of that, how has it transformed you personally?
Well, Andy, I wrote a book about nuclear weapons back in the 80s, late 80s. And in the writing of the book, I learned that the political leaders at the heads of state, of nations, they have more in common with each other in wanting to conduct war, which Orwell says must be continually conducted, than they do with their own citizens. And when I learned about 9/11, that it was actually a false flag operation, I realized, that kind of was a double whammy. Like, it was true with nuclear weapons, and then again, in 2001, there's another example, huge world-changing example of this. And ever since I did, I've always been what I call an overarcher. And people used to say that about me at work, that I was a big picture person. And I think we all need to become big picture people to see the perspective of the world, not just from within one country. And when Graeme says there's no other way to live once you've seen this, once you've seen it, Arundhati Roy said the same thing. You can't unsee it. You've seen it, and all the stuff that's coming across the airwaves, you realize it's just one perspective, and it's never going to have we'll never have a global perspective that will heal the world as long as we listen to our own country's perspective and not the whole world. So I guess that's where I stand, is that I'll never stop, because until we get a global perspective on things.
Graeme, I know you alluded to this when you were speaking before, but if you want to elaborate in any way, just how it personally transformed you beyond knowing this evidence and in the way you see the world.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a very profound answer to that, Andy. I sometimes think I'm not a very introspective person. But I will say a couple of words. First, I appreciate what David and Elizabeth have said very much. I don't know if I have too much to add. This time round, as in the first time round, my own history is quite similar to Elizabeth's. There have been a couple of major moments in my life when I felt I was having an earth-shaking kind of awakening. And one was somewhere around 1980. When I began to fully grasp the nuclear issue and the peril we were in, and the fact that there were people who had put us there and who understood the peril and who were nonetheless pushing ahead. In other words, these bastards were ready to blow up civilization. That's the risk they were taking, and they knew it. And I could barely understand that. In fact, the word civilization doesn't begin to get it because it sounds so kind of dry and so human. It wasn't just human beings. It was all these species and forests and ecosystems. They didn't give a damn. They're willing to blow it up. To me, that was so earth-shaking. It took me years to absorb that. I mean, I was having everything. I was having anticipatory grief. I was having nightmares. You name it. So that really shook my life. As far as 9/11 went, some people tell me that they didn't really understand evil until they were on to 9/11. Well, I think I understood evil because of the nuclear issue. But 9/11 deepened my concept of deception. I thought I understood deception before, but I really didn't realize how deep it went and how pervasive it was in the media, in the political parties, in all areas of government, in my own institution, the university. And of course, then you feel isolated, because when you try to talk to people about it, they call you names and they kind of don't want to have anything to do with you. So I guess that perception of deception and trying to come to grips with it. So then first you have evil, then you have deception. These are very negative things. How do you constitute yourself as a person then? How do you keep your heart open to loving other people and on all living beings? How do you make friends? Who do you hang out with? If the people you thought were your friends before are now calling you a conspiracy nut and so on. And so you have to form new bonds and you come to know new people. And so at a personal and social level, for many of us, and this is certainly true for me, it did have a big effect. I did have to leave certain groups and certain people, certain relationships, and establish new ones, and that's tough. So yeah, I mean, it affects you at every level like that.
All right, so Canada. A lot of great stuff going on there. For our audience, so they can catch up to where we are now, and whoever wants to speak, just go ahead and chime in. Talk about the history of 9/11 Truth actions in Canada, kind of the lead up to what you guys are doing, and then what is going on right now.
Well, Andy, the references to David Griffin, I think, are very significant in regards to what's going on in Canada. There was a statement by David Griffin where he said that the likelihood of a new independent investigation of 9/11 was more likely to occur outside the United States. That was one of the most profound, you said many profound things, but to me, that was a very profound statement. And after handing out with about a dozen other activists in Ottawa more than 12,000 DVDs on Rideau Street, it had come to the point where every person that came by said, yes, I already have one, thank you. Yep, 9/11 was an inside job. Yep, Towers said, okay, all right, so we've now reached saturation. So I looked up Rideau Street, and just up Rideau Street, that's where Parliament Hill is. And I realized that we had to go to a new plane now. Street activism had reached a point where everybody, at least in our area, knew. So we needed to go into a new domain. And I was thinking about what David Griffin had said, and I looked up the process for creating a petition to Parliament. And lo and behold, after some research, I found that all Canadians have the right to take a petition to Parliament, and they can do this directly. They don't need to have an election or anything like that. They can actually just exercise this right. And I thought about that in the context of what David Griffin had said. And I started to think to myself that the reason that it would work in Canada is that the ground here is more fertile for an investigation than in the United States. And there's a number of factors there. Number one, in my mind, was that there is a general sense, and I hope my fellow Canadians can agree with me on this one, that that Canada, although it's a country that doesn't in some ways know what it stands for, one thing that it does know is it's not American. Up here, Canada opposes the American values. Not that they aren't great, but we always see ourselves as not you. If the Canadian identity in any way means that we're not Americans, then the idea of having an investigation of this issue, I think on that basis would go further. And I'm not saying it's going to go all the way, but that would take you a degree further. If you were to ask Canadians about this issue, there would be a general sentiment that they would probably want to do this. And there are other factors as well. The political landscape in Canada is broader, at least in my opinion. So we don't have a two-party system in like you do in the United States. We have, at this time, we have four. And it has occurred in Canadian elections where there have been huge landslide turnovers in government. I would just cite as one example the Conservative majority under Brian Mulroney, which was during the 1980s, went from a majority of something like several hundred seats in Parliament after the election to That's happened in Parliament a number of times. So in a churning landscape where there are these changes, where there is the potential for an issue to be investigated because it's not an American issue, it would be seen as one as something that Canadians would naturally want. I thought, if we were to do it anywhere, this country would be the one where it has the best opportunity. So with these thoughts in mind, and that statement by David Griffin that it was more likely to happen outside the United States, I created this petition. And that, from that point, it took, I think, about 4 years for the petition to actually reach the point now where it's actually being submitted to Parliament. It took about a year to gather all the signatures because under the parliamentary rules, they have to be original signatures. It cannot be an electronic petition, although I think soon the day is coming where that will happen, but that's another story. So they all have to be original signatures, and we collected them from across Canada. It was a national effort, and I think the total number is 1,427 original signatures. From there, it went through the hands of a total of 3 members of Parliament before we were able to actually get one willing to carry it the few feet that was needed to get it to the clerk, so it would actually become part of the parliamentary process. Now, this is very interesting because when a petition is submitted by a member, it becomes part of a process that has to be followed. So the government is now required under the rules of Parliament to respond within 45 days. So what it means is that they have no choice now under the rules of Parliament. They cannot avoid answering the questions that are in the petition. There was a petition that was done in 2008. Its language, in my view, was quite accusatory, and it didn't speak specifically about what the claims were. There was an election, and the matter was dealt with in a very offhand way, where the government came back after the election and said that they, in essence, just accepted the official story given by the United States, and that would be the end of the matter. So they said the government was saying they didn't see any reason to investigate it any further because it had been investigated in the United States. When we wrote the second petition, we were very, very specific about the claims. And the claims were based almost entirely on the evidence provided by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. There's a huge area of 9/11 research, but we chose to focus on the evidence from architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth because it was academically the easiest for people to grasp. So naming the issue regarding Tower 7, for example. The evidence that was in there is unmistakable. We're asking the government to specifically reference this evidence. We were lucky in how we wrote the petition because it referenced the official 9/11 report. And that is very, very good timing because on the day that we had the press conference on Parliament Hill, the U.S. Senate released a report on torture committed by the CIA. I spoke with David Griffin over email to ask him about this evidence. what he indicated to me was that more than 1/4 of the citations in the official 9/11 report, the same report that we petitioned Parliament about, more than 1/4 of the citations in that report were based on evidence that was obtained through the use of torture. And the U.S. government on the same day admitted that this was torture. So there are huge, huge implications, and the timing of these two events could not have been better. So that's the background on the petition.
Well, while you were speaking, I just typed into Google how many Canadians died on 9/11. It tells me at least 24 Canadians lost their lives in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, as Google calls it. And that's a pretty significant number. I mean, 24 lives right there. But when I hear these stories about reaching out to the Canadian government, reaching out to the British government even, reaching out to governments that are friendly with the United States of America, you run into the same kind of stone walls that we run into here. The people screaming conspiracy theory when you talk about physics and common sense, or deferring it to the United States' investigation instead of doing their own, despite the overwhelming evidence that it was controlled demolition on 9/11. And again, I'm throwing this question out there to anyone who wants to answer. Why is that? Why do you think there's such little interest in getting to the bottom, or not even just little interest, but a fear of getting to the bottom of what happened that day, when it was basically essentially happened in a foreign country? From your guys' perspective, it happened in a foreign country. Why do you think, and this is speculation, but why do you think they're covering up for the United States of America?
I'd just like to say that the petition is at a website, David's website, rethink911.ca. Anybody can go there and read the petition. Why is it important to Canadians and other nations? You know, on the 9/11 consensus panel, we have members from all over the world, Europe, a number of Italy, Switzerland. There isn't anybody in England right now, although we're going to invite. We have somebody in mind, but the honorary president of the Italian Supreme Court, Mr. Ferdinando Impazzamato, who was at the Toronto hearings that Graeme put on, he said that it has ruined democracy, not just in the United States, but it's had an undermining effect on democracy all over the world. It's created a false story about what happened. It's created a false flag operation that has changed world relationships. And the people who understand this around the world are just dismayed by it. The fact that we're continuing to act as if this was a real event. And it wasn't. It was a staged event. So it has enormous implications, and people, once they see that, as Graeme said, there's no other way to live. You can't allow the world to go forward as if this was a real event.
What fascinates me is the fact that Canadians are acting like they're covering up. I mean, not Canadian people. I don't talk about the citizens. I'm talking about people in government, the people who get upset when you bring this up. They cover up for the actions, the cover-up of the United States. And I've got my own theories and ideas on that, but I want to hear from you guys. Why do you think that is?
Well, I want to say a few words about that, Andy. Again, I don't think I've got anything original or profound, but Canadians have been aware for a long time that we've got a strange thing going on in our psyche in terms of our relationship to the United States. And I'm speaking collectively about us Canadians. Obviously, we don't all agree. It's tremendous disagreement in Canada. But it's a love-hate relationship. Covering up for the U.S. is nothing new. And Canadian government, they've done it all along. They covered up for the U.S. in the Vietnam War. They covered up in the Cold War. They covered up in the War on Terror. That's the government of Canada doing that. But it involves, to a greater or lesser extent, the opposition parties, as well as the party that happens to be in government at a given moment. And if you ask me what's going on psychologically, I can speculate, but I'm no expert. I know that there are people in the Canadian military who know 9/11 was an inside job because I've talked to them. I know there are, airline pilots in Canada who know that. I know there are former intelligence people in Canada who know that. And I know there's some Canadian members of parliament who know it. And none of those people I'm picturing right now is willing to come out and say it in public. Now, why is that? They're worried they'll lose all their networks and their friends, and everyone will isolate them and hate them, and their career will be destroyed. I think all of the above. And also there's just some profound kind of existential denial that goes on, where people they are just scared of what will happen to the world if this truth becomes known. Everything will change. And you have to also remember that although, as David is right in saying that there's a very strong tendency in Canada to say, well, we're not quite sure who we are, but we know who we aren't. We aren't Americans. Okay, that's true. But also the U.S. are our closest friends and allies, so-called neighbors to the south, blah, blah, blah. So it's a very strange relationship. And you have to remember that there is profound collaboration going on in Canada. Let's not kid ourselves. It happens at the corporate level. It happens at the intelligence level. It happens at the governmental, the military level. So, for example, we've had two quote-unquote terrorist incidents in Canada very recently in October 20th and October 22nd. I don't know if we want to get into them here, but I have profound doubts about both of them. I think they're part of the war on terror, part of the deception, and that the institutions in our country that are handling intelligence, CSIS and the RCMP, everyone knows they're working hand in glove with the FBI and with U.S. intelligence in general on all these issues. In fact, the name of the perpetrator of the Parliament attack on October 22nd was not even released to the public by Canadian intelligence. It was released by American intelligence. About 45 minutes after the guy was killed, CBS was reporting his name. Canadian sources didn't report it for hours after that. So, they work so closely together. There's deep collaboration in the war on terror. And the government we have at the moment in Canada is the most collaborationist of all the ones I can think of in history. And so, they would like to take us fully into the war on terror. And how they will respond to our petition is yet to be seen. I'm not expecting too much from them. But so, I just want to give the sense there's a very complicated relationship between the two countries here.
Now, David, you mentioned the torture report. I talked about the torture report on last week's show that aired on Christmas. You mentioned something to me when we were talking on the phone the other day about evidence based on torture and the consequence of that legally. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, to put it bluntly, anybody would say anything to, if they were being tortured, to get the torture to stop. This is absolutely clear in any court of law anywhere. If you torture somebody, the evidence that you get is not legally admissible. Because the reason is that they will say anything because they're being tortured, so it's not the truth. If it is the truth, it's only coincidental. So if you look at the U.S. government official 9/11 report, it relies heavily on evidence that was obtained through torture. And if you look at the report, and I had talked to David Griffin about this. If you look at the report without that evidence, they essentially have no suspect. So here's how it works. The 9/11 Commission asked the CIA to interview the suspects that had been captured. There was about 60 of them. The CIA refused. The 9/11 Commission came back and asked for a shorter list. I think the number was 9 suspects. The CIA refused. Then there was some discussion, and what they managed to agree on is that there would be a project manager between the 9/11 Commission and the CIA. The Commission would give their questions to the project manager, who would then take them to the CIA, who would then take them to the interrogators, brackets torturers, who would then ask the questions to the suspects who were being tortured. The answers to the questions were then given back to the CIA that reviewed the answers, and then those answers were provided to the 9/11 Commission. These are the statements that were used to create the evidence that created the link to Osama bin Laden. So what you have is not first-hand evidence from a suspect. It's not second-hand. It's barely third-hand evidence obtained through torture that created the myth about Osama bin Laden. If you then look at the evidence in the parliamentary petition, there's almost nothing left in terms of the substance of the 9/11 Commission report. So that's the importance of torture and how it relates. And it's very significant, too, because Canada has said that they've accepted the official 9/11 report as the answer from the U.S. government. And what they're saying is they accept information that's based on torture, which is against Canadian law. It's a huge, huge issue.
And see, this is important, too, in relation to the controlled demolition evidence and trying to get people in authority positions to do something about it, to acknowledge it, because I've found just personally when I talk to congressmen, for instance, they will essentially look the other way from it because you have these guys that exist, you know, your Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, your Osama bin Laden, that have essentially taken the blame for this event. And again, we don't get into complicity very often on this show, but it's the reason that people in power don't want to pay attention to nanothermite in the dust, 105 feet of free fall of Building 7, because despite all of that, they have these people here, whether dead or alive, who have essentially taken the blame for it. Not necessarily voluntarily, but have taken it from the media. And with what you say, the fact that a lot of this evidence that they that these people take the blame, it was taken from torture, essentially undercuts all of that. So now the people in authority have no reason to look away from the controlled demolition evidence. And I want to know, in Canada, have you guys heard anybody in the mainstream media bringing this up? I mean, beyond shaking their head at the idea of the United States torturing somebody, has anybody brought up this fact that the evidence is not valid, that brings into question the 9/11 story and a lot of the other stories that the United States has sold to the world?
Could I leap in here?
Sure.
I don't follow the media in Canada well enough to answer that question, so I'll have to ask Elizabeth and David to say. For my part, though, I just wanted to say this is something we tried to do at our press conference, which was held in the parliamentary buildings in Ottawa, in which we tried to, we gave a chance to the media to come and hear about the petition. We did this just a few days after the petition was tabled. And I just want to tell a little bit more of the story of how that happened. So I had taken a bus 8 hours up to Ottawa and was staying with David. I was down in his basement, and I got out of bed in the morning, and David was down working away in a little room next to the bedroom, and he said, everybody's talking about the Senate torture report. It really seems to be getting some juice in Canada. And I said, well, obviously the 9/11 Commission report is completely based on torture. So would you mind if I kind of rewrote part of my talk, which we were going to give, in a couple of hours, to reflect that? And he said, no, go ahead. So even though we had already printed out versions of what I was going to say, I inserted a new paragraph right at the beginning in which I tried to frame this, although each of us only had 3 minutes to do it, so that the media would get it, that we're talking about torture right now. Well, guess what? 9/11 Commission report is based on torture. And I gave some of the figures that David has mentioned, and then said, that's relevant to our petition because the petition explicitly mentions the 9/11 Commission report and its flawed nature. That's one of the main reasons we need a parliamentary review. Now, I guess I thought, and David thought, that we were kind of giving a gift to the media. We were saying, you're interested in torture. Okay, we're gonna tie our petition to the torture issue. But they didn't pick up on it. And I suppose rather than blaming them for it, I'd say that there's a task we have not yet completed, and that the task is to be insistent and to say more about this, whether it's publishing, getting op-eds written for the papers or what. We need to really pound away on this issue so that, because most Canadians, I don't think, have a clue that the 9/11 Commission report was based on torture. So our task is clear here.
Elizabeth, you were going to say something?
Yes. Well, Graeme has actually said it probably better. Actually, we did get some good press from the Parliamentary Press Gallery, which was December 10th, which was 1 week after the petition was tabled in Parliament. For the first time, I think, in Canada, a national TV network, Global TV, ran coverage of an academic researcher, and that was Graeme speaking about the 9/11 consensus panel, and that coverage is actually available on the Global News website. The other thing that happened was that we videotaped the whole 22-minute press conference, and that's on YouTube, and it's been viewed about 11,000 times already. And anybody who's interested in looking at that press conference, it's really interesting. The press conference took place in the center block of Canada's Parliament buildings. This is where the Prime Minister makes announcements. And so all the flags of Canada are behind the speakers, and you can see this 22-minute press conference if you go to look up on YouTube, rethink911.ca, 9/11 petition press conference. And the more people who view that, it will be an indication of how much interest there is in what's going on in Canada. And when we make our next steps towards, dealing with Parliament and trying to promote what's been going on with the petition, we can say, there have been, as of December 29th, there were 11,000 people. Maybe by the middle of January, there'll be double that many of people, and that's a good indicator. We can send this information to the parliamentarians to say, this is not a tinfoil hat issue. It's an issue of substantial concern to a lot of people who are concerned about the undermining of democracy through the 9/11 false flag operation.
Wow, an hour is not enough. I want to know, in our last couple of minutes here, what else can Canadians do? What can people in the United States do to help out what you're doing in Canada, your efforts? How can we be of assistance, all of us?
All Canadians who care about this issue, all Americans who care about this issue, who care about their constitutions and their country, should be calling, emailing, faxing the 308 members of Parliament to tell them that they care about this issue. And they should not stop. There should be a torrent of phone calls all day, every day, until the petition is responded to in Parliament and until we get the answer that we're looking for. To find the members of Parliament, it's easy. You just go to parl.gc.ca. The name the email address, the phone number, the fax number of every member of Parliament is on that website. People need to speak out. This is the time. They need to communicate in huge numbers, and anybody can do that.
And people always ask, why is it important to reach out in other countries? Who cares if another country has an investigation? They don't have any jurisdiction over America. Well, first of all, it makes a big noise all over the world, especially a country like Canada, so close to the United States. If they had their real investigation there and recognized the controlled demolition evidence for what it was, and then of course that affects relations with the United States and applies the pressure on our nation on the outside. And as we apply the pressure from within, something has got to crack. So it's absolutely important to reach out anywhere and everywhere that you can if you are an activist here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. And I've said this before on the show, you know, talking to people like we have here on the line right now in Canada, talking to people in Europe, folks like this, like these individuals, I feel a closer bond with as a countryman than I do someone like, than someone like George Bush or Barack Obama or any of these congressmen who really don't represent me, people who are not there representing the best interests of people in the United States. I feel closer to these people around the world as a citizen of humanity, of who basically cares about justice and doing the right thing. And I'm honored to have all of you guys on the show here today, and I hope you come back again later on to tell us how this has gone and to tell us about the successes you guys have achieved. But thank you all for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
It's been a wonderful show.
Thanks very much, Andy.
You can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.
The 9/11 Commission, which was tasked with giving us the fullest explanation. No, not one sentence in the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission report even mentions the destruction of World Trade Center 7. Is this one of the reasons, perhaps, that Senator Max Cleland resigns from the commission, citing it's a national scandal? The investigation is compromised. How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. Here's a floor plan of Building 7. Now, to bring a building smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint without falling over, what we have to do is remove the core columns, because what we want to do is bring the outside of the building in on itself. Now, this involves a high degree of precision that fire is not capable of, being an organic process.